My name is Jerry Ann Bogus, and I'm the Executive Director of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Woo! This is an extension of the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail, where we're working to extend our reach beyond Portsmouth to the rest of the state. And I truly believe, and this may be a testament to that, that highlighting these little-known stories that are inclusive and change how we look at New Hampshire can do a long way to erase historical stereotypes. And I think the stories that we're going to hear today do just that. It shows a people of courage, people of resilience, and a people of determination. And from New Hampshire, the state that's normally billed as the whitest state in the Union, that has an over 400-year-old black history in the state. When one thinks of our founding fathers, enslavement does not come up in their consciousness. Many citizens seem to forget that a few of our founding fathers were themselves slave owners. Drawing on a wide array of primary sources, from slave owners' diaries to academic books and other historical resources from plantation life is revealed. The story of African American is deeply embedded in the history of America. Slavery was the basis of much of the nation's wealth. There is always an underside, hidden from the sight, the more unpleasant or reprehensible side that needs to surface to give an integral portrait of a historical event or person. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? This is one of the obscure story, but also true. It is an American story. It is a New Hampshire story that serves to inspire and enrich our understanding of the American past. What you're about to see is a one-woman performance in first person. At the end of the performance, the actor will talk about the character and answer any questions you may have. It is 1845, and Ona Judge is at her home in Greenland, New Hampshire, and a group of people show up at her doorstep with a reporter.
You have a reporter with you. I know what he wants to ask me. One more time, and then I'm done. One more time. I took my first breath there at Mount Vernon in 1773. Not sure of the day or the month, but one thing I am sure of: not until his death did I feel freedom. Oh yes, yes, he was great as a general, president of this country. Well, some would say father to his children, husband to his wife. Towards me, not great. Not great at all. To him, I own property. That's all. Property. Property like the Mansion House Farm. At the Mansion House Farm, I lived a comfortable life. I had clothes better than the field hands. Well, I wore practically nothing. Nothing at all. Now, the old folks who were too old to work out in the fields, well, they had the worst clothing of all. Martha's housemaids, they wore gowns of calico and linen. Didn't matter. We're all slaves, house slaves, field slaves. We're all the same, all the same. Oh yeah, I was taught many things by my mother and the other slave women in the house. How to be a good slave. How to be a good slave. And I asked questions but never got the answers that I should have received. No, I didn't. Now, there were 90 folks that lived at the mansion farmhouse. There were more men than women and fewer children. So I always found cause to run about and go to the other 4 farms that the general owned. Now my favorite farm, Doe Run Farm. That's where all the saltwater slaves lived and worked. And my friend Sambo, he would go there too. Sambo. Do you know what the name Sambo means? Well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you. It means second son. That's what it means. Now, down there at Doe Run Farm, we held night meetings, and we had to carry torches to light the way. And folks would go down there and meet up with their family and their friends that they hadn't seen in a long, long time. You see, you could be married but not be together. You have a wife working on one farm, a husband working on the other, and children on another. That's right, children on another. Children started working at the age of 8 or 9 years old. Now, what you say? Who were the saltwater slaves? I thought everybody knew who the saltwater slaves were. They were born in Africa, forced here in chains on slave ships. Now, my friend said, what? Oh, no. They all died out. They all died out, or they mixed with white and Indian. Now, my mama said that my papa white, indentured servant, and after 4 years, he got his papers. 4 years. Where was I? Oh, I was talking about Sambo. Now, Sambo was a saltwater slave, and everybody listened when he spoke. And he kept the stories. He kept the stories alive. You see, Sambo told me that his father was a griot. That's an African word for storyteller. And that he had the history of his people right up in his head. And Sambo said that whenever a storyteller died, he took the knowledge of 100 men with him. 100 men. Now, everybody got an opportunity to talk. Oh, yeah. I remember the time Nathan, he body servant to the general. Oh, Lord, that boy could talk the bark off a tree. You hear me? But mostly, he would talk about the secrets of the general. Understand. There was a big dust-up going on at the time. Big dust-up. Now, that's what we call a fight. A fight between the white folks here and the white folks in England. Now, the white folks here say they being oppressed. Being oppressed, that they tired of being slaves to the British. And the British folks, they say, if we go with them, fight for them, they give us freedom, give us liberty. At Mount Vernon, we all kind of folks. Some right off the boat from Africa. Some born here. Some speak English, and some don't know nothing about it. some Christian, taught by the Baptists and the Methodists, and some Muslim. But they all trying to talk. They all trying to understand. Some say they go with whoever gives them liberty. Oh yeah, it got hot up in there one night. Got as hot as a winter bonfire. Excuse me just one second. Got hot as a winter bonfire. And old Father Jack, saltwater slave. Now they tell me that when I was little, he had to be about 100 years old. So Father Jack, he had to calm things down. So he stood up and he was wearing this raggedy old turban draped on his head that hung down on his shoulders and had an old blanket covering his night shirt. And Father Jack stood up and he said, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. Well, by the spring of 1781, a British warship came straight up the Potomac. It was called Savage. It was called Savage. And 14 slave men and 3 slave women got on that British warship. Now, at the time, Mr. Lund was the overseer. He was in charge because the general was not there. And he had slaves carry supplies on that ship. If he hadn't, the British say they would burn him to the ground. And when the general returned and he heard what Mr. Lund did, he was not pleased. He said to Mr. Lund, he should have let him burn it to the ground. Burn it to the ground. That's what he told us. That's what he told us. Well, sir, I tell you, I started working as a child about 8 years old. You see, the general, he was so proud of his 5 farms. So proud of his farm. Even though he said he wanted them to burn it to the ground, he was still proud of his farms, you see. He worked 200 or maybe 300 men, women, and children on his farms. Yes, he did. And the overseers, well, they were in charge of all the field hands. But the mansion house where I lived, you know who was in charge? Martha. Martha was in charge. That woman would come from the main house to the kitchen, to the chicken yard, to the storehouse, the warehouse, the wash house, to make sure everything was done the way she had it lined up. She even checked out the garden, made sure everything was going right in the garden. That's what she did. Now the women slaves in the house, well, they did the spinning and the weaving, the cooking and the cleaning. They did everything that they were instructed to do. And I worked right along with them. I worked right along with them. And I even did the washing. You know what the difference is between washing clothes when I was young and washing clothes now? You know what the difference is? Nothing. Nothing at all. It is still brutal. Still brutal. Yeah, well, by the time I was 10, the women in the house, they taught me how to do needlework, embroidery, crochet. And pretty soon, at 10, I became the body servant of the lady. Now, you know what that entails, being a servant for the lady, her body servant? Well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you. I was involved in every detail of her life. Every detail of her life. I listened to her queries, complaints, lots of complaints, personal confession. I bathed her. Now think about it. A 10-year-old girl bathing a full-grown woman. I would powder and dress her for special receptions and meetings and gatherings. All day long I was at her side, at her call. And then when nighttime ran around, I got her ready for bed. I undressed her, even helped her up in the bed. And I had to brush off her clothes. And I had to fold them in a certain way and put them in a certain spot, just the way she instructed. Now, I did this every day. Now, the children out in the field, they work 6 days a week, sun up to sundown. But I'm a house servant, as she called us, servants, but we knew we were slaves. I worked every day. I was at her command. Then one day, it all ended. Well, the war, that is. The war ended. She received a letter. The war had ended. Her life and the general's life started to change. Not my life. Not right then. Not right then. My life didn't change until the general became president of this country. 6 slaves and myself were brought to New York City to work in the presidential residence. And when I stepped into that house, oh, what a palace I walked into. It had the finest furniture. Even had wallpaper. 2 stories of wallpaper. Had little pigeons painted on the wallpaper. And they had a quantity of plate and china. And on top of that, the lady had a new quilted skirt made for me. And she gave me a flannel skirt, underskirt, and she even got me some new shoes. And I had the best clothing and food to eat. And I thought that these were gifts of love. That's what I thought. Well, she indulged me. She indulged me. Now, several times a week, I would ride with the lady in her carriage to go and visit the wives of political leaders. And they would greet her like a queen, like they were in court. So I would retreat along with the other servants to the kitchen. And we held our own court with gossip and things to eat and, oh, just talk. And there I met free people of color. And they asked me, are you bound or free? I said bound. But I'm like a daughter. Ooh, no sooner did those words come out of my mouth, they all came at me. You's a slave girl, that's all. Property. You know, daughter, property. Well, I started asking questions, and my head began to swell. Well, I think it's time for me to leave right now. I think I left something in there on it, so maybe another day you can come back and hear the rest of this story.
Thank you, Ona, for a little bit of your story. We're going to get ready for the next part of our program. So we're excited to have Professor Erica Armstrong Dunbar with us. She is a Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Black American Studies and History of the University of Delaware. She has recently participated in several documentaries, including Philadelphia, The Great Experiment, and The Abolitionists, an American Experience, produced on PBS. In 2011, Professor Dunbar was appointed the first director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia. She has been the recipient of Ford Medal and SSRC fellowships, and most recently has been named an Organization of American Historian Distinguished Lecturer. Her first book, A Fragile Freedom, African American Women and Emancipation in the Antebellum City, was published by Yale University Press in 2008. And today we welcome her to talk about her new book, Never Caught, Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge. And we welcome Professor Dunbar to the program.
So good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Happy Women's History Month. It's March. We had a few issues with our cords and cables and things, and you can tell I'm a professor who's used to sort of walking into random classes because I had adapters in my purse so that you all get to see the images that I have to share today. Let me just offer a few thanks before we start our conversation with one another. I need to thank Jerry Ann, who's done just Can you all hear me at all? Barely. I don't. Let's see. How's that? Okay. And of course, Gwendolyn for just a fantastic presentation. You know, it's so important, I think, to be able to tell history in different ways. It's important to reach large audiences. Oh, I see people in the back, and I feel so badly. I want you all to, can people come, if you want, come in. There's some room over here on the sides if you'd like. See, people are doing it over here, so don't feel uncomfortable about it. There is some room over on the side, so come in, please. I don't want you all standing in the back. So I think it's just so important to tell stories. To tell stories of American history. I don't think that we can kind of understand our present, let alone our future, if we don't understand our past. And so what I tried to do with this book, Never Caught, was to give us a different lens through which to see the building of the nation. So often we hear the stories of founding fathers through just that, through founding fathers. And what I wanted to do was to tell a different story, to tell a story of the beginning of the nation through the eyes of the enslaved. And Ona gives us that opportunity. By traveling from Virginia to New York to Philadelphia and eventually to Portsmouth, she's sort of the perfect vehicle to look at how the nation changes, what the laws are, how the states are different from between one another. But to do this, as I said, through the eyes of the enslaved and, of course, a fugitive. I actually met Ona in the archives. No, she's not still alive. I hear Frederick Douglass, maybe. So I met Ona in the archives about 20 years ago. I was working on a project. I was working on my first project about African American women becoming free. And so I'm sitting at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and I'm looking through microfilm. And, you know, wiping my eyes, and it's dusty and cold, and I'm looking through newspapers. I want to sort of see what everyday life was like at the end of the 18th century. And I come across an advertisement for a runaway slave. And the ad noted a woman about 20 years of age who they called Oney. They called her Oney Judge, and that she had run off from the president's house. And I thought, whoa, wait, what? Who is Oney Judge? How did she run away from the President of the United States? Why is he advertising for her in Philadelphia? And what happened to her? And really, those questions led me really to continue to think about her for a long time. And I thought maybe I would kind of try to think about her story and bring that into my first book. And I said, you know what? No, I'm going to come back to this project. And I'll be very honest. I didn't know if I would have enough to write a book. There were a couple of treatments of Ona, sort of in a chapter maybe here or there, and a couple of sort of Washington biographies, online articles, but no book about Ona. And I thought, well, that's odd, that's weird, why is that? And then about 5 years into the research, I realized why. It's hard, and she wanted to live a life that was anonymous. She was a fugitive for more than half a century. And that meant, for the most part, she lived in the shadows. And in that way, her life was not different from so many others who ran from the jaws of slavery to look for some semblance of freedom. Now, when I, sort of all in, it took me about 9 years to research and write this book. That's sort of typical for historians. We're slow. We take our time. We're supposed to, right? We're supposed to do that. And towards the end, when I was talking about the title of the book, Never Caught, my editor liked it, but some other folks really did not. And they were like, Erica, you're giving away the story. Giving away the story. And I said, you know, well, that didn't seem to be a problem with 12 Years a Slave. I know it's 12 years. You know what's going to happen at the end. And what I wanted to make very clear, I wanted to stay away from words like freedom or free, because the reality was that Ona Judge was never free. Never. She lived as a free person here in Portsmouth and in Greenland, but she was never free. She was simply never caught. And I wanted to make that distinction in the title, in some ways trying to break down the myths of what freedom and slavery meant at this time. This idea that the North was free and the South had slaves. Well, as you see in the book, for those of you who've read it and those of you who will buy your copy later on, we know that slavery exists everywhere just about. It's not Virginia. Virginia is not the first colony to legalize slavery. It was Massachusetts that did that. And so I tried very much in this book to tell this story, to dismantle some of the myths about slavery and freedom in the North and in the South. So today what I'll do is I'll offer a bit of context, show a few slides. I'm also going to read a little bit from the book. Yay! So that you'll get a preview and then go buy the book. So, spring rain drenched the streets of Philadelphia in 1796. Weather in the city of brotherly love was often fickle at this time of year, vacillating between extreme cold and oppressive heat. But rain was almost always appreciated in the nation's capital. It erased the putrid smells of rotting food, of animal waste that permeated the cobblestone roads of the new nation. It reminded Philadelphians that the long and punishing winter was behind them. Spring rain cleansed the streets and souls of Philadelphians, ushering in optimism and hope and a feeling of rebirth. And in the midst of the promises of spring, Ona Judge, a young, black, enslaved woman, received devastating news. She learned that she was to leave Philadelphia, a city that had become her home, and that she was to travel back to her birthplace of Virginia and prepare to be bequeathed, given away to her owner's granddaughter. Today, we'll introduce one of the most understudied fugitive slaves in America. At the age of 22, Judge stole herself from the Washingtons, forcing the president to show his slave-catching hand. As a fugitive, Judge would test the president's will and his reputation. The most important man in the nation, heralded with winning the American Revolution, could not reclaim the family's slave woman. Ona Judge did what just about no one else could do. She beat the president. Judge was never caught. This is an image of Mount Vernon, and while it's a little bit later, it's an image from 1872. There's some earlier ones, but not quite as good as this one. I always think it's very important sort of visually for us to be in the place where Ona was born, a house that she eventually would come to serve, as we just heard earlier. Today I introduce a new American hero, a slave girl raised at Mount Vernon who, once exposed to the ideas of freedom, was compelled to pursue it at any cost. This was a woman who found the courage to defy the President of the United States, the wit to find allies, to escape, to out-negotiate, to run, and to survive. Her story is the only existing account through interviews that she left at the end of her life. You saw one earlier. The only existing account of a fugitive once held by the Washingtons. And it's the only account, we believe, of a fugitive slave from Virginia in the 18th century. Judge's life exposes the sting of slavery and the drive of defiance. She guarded her freedom every day of her life, never regretting her decision to fight for what she believed in, and that was her right to be free. We know that she was born sometime in 1773 at Mount Vernon. We don't have an exact birth date because Washington and Martha Washington did not keep records, or at least records that noted the birth date of the enslaved. So we sort of have to go by other markers. So we know that she's born sometime around 1773, the sort of midst of this era of the American Revolution. She's born to an enslaved woman named Betty, who was the property, and I think this is important to note, she was actually the property of Martha. Martha was married once before George Washington, and George was her second husband, and her husband died, and making her one of the richest widows in all of the Chesapeake. So when George Washington married Martha, he was kind of making out better on that deal. He was sort of coming up financially. She had more slaves, more property. He, of course, had Mount Vernon. And she would come to Mount Vernon with her enslaved property, and one of those slaves was Betty. Betty would become Ona Judge's mother. She would travel with her infant son, who was named Austin, who would eventually also serve the Washingtons in New York and Philadelphia. While at Mount Vernon, Betty became known as a talented seamstress, worked in the mansion house, and at some point has, I won't use the term relationship, but an encounter of some sort with a white indentured servant by the name of Andrew Judge. And so it's a sort of interesting moment to think about what Mount Vernon looks like then. Clearly the majority of laborers were enslaved, but there were white indentured servants as well. Washington purchased his indenture in Baltimore, and he would eventually come. He was a tailor. There was no one else in all of Fairfax County with the last name of Judge. And so it's clear that the Washingtons recognize Ona's parentage by having her surname of Judge appear in all of the records at Mount Vernon. He would, as I said, serve as a tailor and sort of be known for making some of the more important uniforms that Washington wore during the war and afterwards. Eventually he would leave Mount Vernon, and I was able to track him. He would leave, he would have a family of his own and purchase property, never to return. So he left behind Ona Judge, who by the age of 10 was brought up to the mansion house. And she was brought up to teach, she was taught how to sew, and sort of the typical domestic duties of a house slave. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to kind of break down the myths about what it meant to be a house slave. There's sort of this stereotype that the work was easier or better than those who worked in the fields or in agricultural production. And I think we know through Ona's story and through the stories of others that it was anything but easy. That these women would go back and forth from the pump 10 times a day, carrying cauldrons of water in order to be able to wash clothing. They would make soap from hand by hand from lye and dung. They were responsible for preparing the meals. They would rise before the sun appeared and go to bed very late. And so we get to see these responsibilities through Ona's life, so that by the time 1789 rolls around and Washington is elected president and travels to New York, Ona is what we would call a teenager. She's about 16 years old. And George Washington goes to New York. This is an image of Federal Hall on Wall Street in New York, where he would take the oath of office. And I always sort of make this point that when he did, he was alone. Martha did not come with him. She was unhappy about a move. Another familiar story. And she wrote about it. She told people she actually referred to her time in the North as the lost days. She didn't want to leave Mount Vernon. She felt like she had shared George Washington with the people for long enough with the American Revolution, that they had had time back at Mount Vernon to be together, and now it was disrupted. She was also worried about his health. She didn't want to go. She was upset, and Washington and Tobias Lear, his secretary, would write letters home to her, coaxing her to come, telling her about the great chef they had, the foods they were preparing, and that they were much desirous of seeing her. She took her time. Eventually, she would come to New York and would bring the majority of the 7 enslaved men and women who would come. And Ona Judge was one of them. So 5 men, 2 women. Ona as a 16-year-old. I'm going to read a bit from my book about this moment. The young Ona Judge was far from an experienced traveler. The teenager knew only Mount Vernon and its surroundings and had never traveled far from her family and loved ones. For Judge, the move must have been similar to the dreaded auction block. Although she was not to be sold to a different owner, she was forced to leave her family for an unfamiliar destination hundreds of miles away. Judge would have no choice but to stifle the terror she felt and to go on about the work of preparing to move, folding linens, packing Martha Washington's dresses and personal accessories, helping with the grandchildren or the tasks at hand. And it wasn't her place to complain or question. Judge had to remain strong and steady, if not for herself, then for her mistress, who appeared to be falling apart at the seams. Like Judge, Martha Washington had no choice about the move to New York. Her life was at the direction of her husband, who was now the most powerful man in the country. Mrs. Washington and Ona Judge may have shared similar concerns, but of course only Martha Washington was allowed to express discontent and sorrow. Martha Washington was unhappy, and everyone knew it, including her frightened slave. The president's nephew, Robert Lewis, would also soon be made aware of it. When he arrived at the estate on May 14th, things were in disarray. Lewis, who served as Washington's secretary between 1789 and 91, was chosen to escort his aunt and her grandchildren to New York, but was surprised and a bit concerned when he arrived to find a frenzied and hectic scene. Lewis wrote, quote, "Everything appeared to be in confusion," end quote. The manifestation of Mrs. Washington's conflicting feelings. Robert Lewis described the departure, which finally took place on May 16, 1789, as an emotional moment for the slaves and the First Lady. He wrote, "After an early dinner, and making all necessary arrangements in which we were greatly retarded, it brought us to 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we left Mount V. The servants of the house and a number of the field negroes made their appearance. To take leave of their mistress, numbers of these poor wretches seemed greatly agitated, much affected, my aunt equally so. Betty, Ona Judge's mother, must have been one of those agitated slaves. Not only was she losing her 16-year-old daughter, but she was losing her son, Austin, who would serve as one of the Washington's waiters Austin's wife Charlotte and their children would have joined in the mourning. Betty watched her children leave Mount Vernon, a reminder of what little control enslaved mothers had over the lives of their children. If she found any comfort in that day, it would have been that brother and sister were traveling together. Austin was older and male and could look out for his younger sister, but still, Betty knew that her relationship with her children would never be the same. So she would leave as a teenager for New York, and actually only remain in New York for a brief period of time. For those of you who know the whole Hamilton story and Hamilton craze with the switch of the nation's capital from New York eventually to Philadelphia, in November of 1790, the Washingtons would leave New York for Philadelphia. But I want to make a point about this move to New York. It was really for the first time in Ona's life that she encountered a significant population of free black people. At Mount Vernon, in Virginia, the number was relatively small. And while New York was still a sort of hotbed for slavery, there were over 20,000 enslaved people still in the state of New York by 1789. There were a couple thousand free blacks. And so this was Ona's kind of first engagement with a free black population, one that would grow and change and develop once she arrived in Philadelphia. This is an image of the home, the president's house in Philadelphia, which stands, for those of you who've been to visit the Liberty Bell and National Constitution Center, it's right there, basically. And the people of Philadelphia have worked really hard to try and reclaim and uncover some of the archaeological finds of where that house was. It no longer stands. But this is an image from the 1830s, a little bit later, of the house. And I want us to look at it because we often think of what the president's house should be. Our image is of a White House, right? A large kind of estate. Well, this is a relatively modest-sized house compared to what we're accustomed to. At that time, it was considerable in size. But what's important to note is that there were a number of people in that house all the time. The Washingtons would up the number of enslaved people from 7 to 9 in Philadelphia. There were teams of servants and secretaries. There were more than 20-odd people living in the house at one moment. So Ona was never alone. Never really had that privacy. But I argue those who worked as agricultural laborers, field slaves, they returned to their quarters in the evening where they could laugh and love and talk without the sort of watchful eyes of an owner. Ona did not have that experience. She lived all of the time, day and night, and the work was unyielding. She was responsible. She had moved up the chain, for the lack of a sort of better phrase, and had become Martha Washington's top slave. And as we heard earlier, she was responsible for the most intimate of responsibilities. Bathing, clothing, brushing her hair. And she was around. She heard everything. She saw everything. And she really, I argue, it's in Philadelphia where she kind of comes of age. And she comes of age in a place where slavery was almost dead. She arrives in Philadelphia and she is in the minority as an enslaved person. Pennsylvanians had begun to dismantle slavery almost a decade before she arrived. So it was odd for Washington to come in a way that was different from New York. It shows us once again the difference between states. That New York, sort of everybody, including the governor of New York, had slaves. Wasn't the case in Pennsylvania. And Washington, and we can talk about this maybe in the Q&A, would have to be very careful circumventing the law on occasion to keep his slaves with him. And so Ona was, as I argue, she came of age in a place that black freedom was palpable, it was visible, she could see it. She could see free black men and women selling their fruits and their oysters on the streets of Philadelphia and taking home their money to take care of their families. She could see Richard Allen building Mother Bethel Church around the corner. She saw black freedom in a way that was different than what she had ever seen at Mount Vernon. The people who, for the most part, found freedom did so by running away, so there was a marker of that in her mind. The men and women who ran off to fight with the British with a promise of freedom, she saw that. She knew of it. Others would run away from George and Martha Washington. But it was here in Philadelphia that she centered in this epicenter of black freedom. Philly would have the largest free black population until the 1830s anywhere in the nation. And it's here that Ona is influenced not just by free blacks, but also by wage-earning white men and women. It was this moment when wage labor became the norm, or started to become the norm. She saw people working, making a wage, taking care of themselves. And this influenced her. In February of 1796, there was an unease in the executive mansion. A thick tension prompted Ona Judge and her enslaved companions to tread lightly around George and Martha Washington. Enslaved men and women always moved about their days with caution, not knowing what events could sour or sweeten an owner's mood. The accidental breaking of a dish or inconveniently timed bad weather could alter the disposition of an owner. Although the president had not earned a reputation for being a sort of violent or extremely physically punishing owner, he did, on occasion, lose his temper. And Ona Judge maneuvers through the daily tasks of the president's house. She knows her mistress well. And she knew just how important Martha Washington's relationship was with her grandchildren. Just a note, Martha, she outlived all of her children. All of them died as either small children or young adults. So that by the time Washington becomes the president, she is left only really with grandchildren. Her son John dies, and she actually takes 2 of his children to live with the Washingtons in New York and then Philadelphia. So we have grandparents raising grandchildren. Another sort of note, the reason the grandchildren's presence and their relationship with Martha becomes so very important is because George Washington and Martha Washington never had children. So George Washington had no biological children. And I think that becomes important as we think about him later on in his life. So she turns her attention, Martha Washington turns her attention to her grandchildren. And this becomes apparent how much she cares about them in February 6th of 1796. She receives a letter in the mail from Eliza Parke Custis Law. This was one of her grandchildren, not one of them who lived with her. Eliza lived in Virginia. And Eliza sent home a letter to Philadelphia on February 6th to George Washington, telling him that she was getting married. And nobody knew this guy. She had had this kind of fast love affair, engagement with a man named Thomas Law, who was 20 years older than she. He was an Englishman. He'd spent a considerable amount of time in India, and he'd come to America in 1794. He was sort of dabbling in land speculation around the federal city. And he brought with him to America 2 of his 3 children, who were biracial. Indian mother who does not come to America. And so all of these things are setting off just red flags for the Washingtons. They're shocked at the letter. They knew nothing about this guy. He's 20 years older. They're worried that he'll take her back to England. Who are these biracial children running around? It's interesting, when I was in the archives reading about this moment, it's interesting to see how Martha Washington in particular behaved. George Washington responded in a letter to Eliza. Eliza says, don't, just wait, give it a chance. He's going to write to you, Thomas Law, please, just think about it. Please, I want your blessing. And Washington, in this kind of very lukewarm way, says, okay, if this is what you want, but please just tell him not to take you from us. We don't want you to go live in England. So he sort of says, okay, I bless the marriage. Come visit us in Philly. And Martha is just kind of distraught about it. And everyone at the executive mansion knows that she's distraught, but her feelings change. And she's, by the end of the month, by the end of February, she's telling everyone, all her friends, and yes, Eliza's getting married, and so John Adams is right. I'm looking through John Adams' letters to Abigail, and he was the sort of gossip. And he says, yes, and Eliza's getting married to this man that nobody knows, and he's got these swarthy children, and everyone's pretending to be happy about it. So, this kind of correspondence reminds us, or reminded me, that this was gossip. This was 18th century, Entertainment Tonight. And the Washingtons blessed the marriage, and she married. March 21st, 1796. And Ona Judge had no idea that this marriage would begin, really, the dismantling of her life. I use this image for a reason, because I think it captures the reputation of Eliza Parke Custis Law. This was taken, supposedly George Washington was sitting for a portrait, and Eliza, who was known for being a kind of impatient and difficult and sometimes volcanic person, busted in the room, and the painter actually decided to paint her as well, and in this stance. And when I show this image, people are like, okay. She would come to Philadelphia, she'd refuse to go to church, Martha would pull her hair out, and George kind of thought it was funny. She was a woman, sometimes she kind of got a bad rap, because I do think that as an 18th century woman who knew what she wanted, went after it, didn't care what people thought, that kind of gave her a bad rap in the 18th century. But there was a little bit of, there were some problems with Eliza that I would come to find out later on as I tracked her life as well. By March wedding, everyone knew, at least in the executive mansion, that Washington had decided not to run for a 3rd term in office. It wasn't public knowledge yet, but the family knew, which meant the enslaved people at the Philadelphia House knew. And they knew that they would eventually be returned to Virginia. And for some, this would have been exciting. This would have been a reminder of this sort of return to their families that they had left behind. But Ona Judge had lived in the North for 7 years, and the thought of returning to Mount Vernon did not settle well. It reminded her that she and her enslaved companions were the property of another person. And it didn't matter that she had lived in the city, in Philadelphia, for over 6 years. Her fate was revealed. The Washingtons were planning on taking their summer trip back to Mount Vernon, and they were packing, and at some point, we don't know exactly when, but Ona finds out that she will be given to Eliza Parke Custis Law. And later on in her interviews, she's very clear that this was the moment. That there were many other kind of influencing factors that would make any person who was enslaved think about finding freedom, attempting to find freedom. But this moment right here, the transition from the Washingtons to the volcanic Eliza Custis Law, she knew that that would most likely doom her to a life of poor treatment, uncertainty, and she simply couldn't let that happen. I'll read a moment from the book. Judge knew what the future held should she not heed the advice of her free black associates. She supposed if she went back to Virginia, she would never have a chance to escape. Once she learned that, quote, upon the decease of her master and mistress, she would become the property of a granddaughter of theirs by the name of Custis, end quote, she knew that she had to flee. She imagined that her work for the laws would begin immediately, not after the death of her owners, prompting a fierce clarity about her future and her dislike for Eliza Custis. She stated in her interview she was determined never to be her slave, end quote. Her decision was made. She would risk everything to avoid the clutches of the new Mrs. Law. Judge was well informed and knew that her decision to flee was far more than risky. But still she was willing to face dog-sniffing kidnappers and bounty hunters for the rest of her life. Yes, her fear was consuming, but so too was her anger. Judge could no longer stomach her enslavement, and it was the change in her ownership that pulled the trigger on Judge's fury. She had given everything to the Washingtons. For 12 years she had served her mistress faithfully, and now she was to be discarded like the scraps of material that she cut from Martha Washington's dresses. Any false illusions she had clung to had evaporated, and Judge knew that no matter how obedient or loyal she may have appeared to her owners, she would never be considered fully human. Her fidelity meant nothing to the Washingtons. She was their property, to be sold, mortgaged, or traded with whomever they wished. And so this is the moment that Ona decides to run. And this document that I'll show you next is where I sort of met Ona in the archives. This is one of the runaway slave advertisements that appears in Claypool's Daily American Advertiser, and another one appears in the Philadelphia Gazette. And these runaway slave advertisements appear for over a week. Ona Judge runs out of the mansion house in Philadelphia on Saturday, May 21st, 1796, while the Washingtons ate their supper. And she never returned. I won't read all of the advertisement, but I do think part of it is interesting. Absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday afternoon, Oney Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy black hair. She's of middle stature, slender and delicately made, about 20 years of age. Now, there have been some questions why we often see her name referred to as Oney in children's books and in things written about her. I contend when I first arrived on one of my trips to Portsmouth, I met with Valerie Cunningham, who everybody meets with if they're doing any kind of work like this. And I said to her, you know, what do you think? I have my ideas about why they called her Oney. I think it was a nickname. And she said, I agree. I believe it was the diminutive of her name, like little Oney. Because at the end of her life, Ona goes by Ona. So I chose to use that name, a kind of marker of adult dignity, when we talk about Ona Judge. But in all of the records from Mount Vernon, they refer to her as Oney. And so these ads run for nearly a week. And what's interesting is in the advertisement, they say that a $10 reward will be paid to any person, white or black, who'll bring her back. And so it's clear that they know or think that the black community was involved, and they were right. Ona Judge tells us in her interviews that the free colored people of Philadelphia help her. And the only name she ever gives up, she's very careful, she can't give names. Because to help and assist a fugitive slave was to basically break the law. Right? It was a federal crime to aid or harbor a fugitive. So she gives us no names. However, in the book I tell you who I'm pretty sure was involved in her escape. The only name she gives us is John Bowles, who was from New Hampshire, who was a ship captain. He was a merchant. He had a business. And she gives us his name because he's deceased. And she knows he'll be protected because of that. And I'm so glad she does, because what I was able to do archivally is she gave me that name. I could track John Bowles, his ships, and as they sailed from Portsmouth, eventually to New York, and then Philadelphia, and guess whose ship I found in the port of Philadelphia the last 2 weeks of May in Philadelphia, Mr. Bowles. So I know this ship, the Nancy, is the ship that Ona boarded, and that eventually ferried her to freedom. Now, I don't want to give away the entire book, because, I want you to buy it and read it. And I do, however, understand that I'm in Portsmouth, so, I'm like, okay, we want some Portsmouth talk right here. And I'm happy to sort of do that a bit in Q&A, but I think it's important to note that the second part of the title is the Washington's relentless pursuit of their runaway slave, and it really was relentless. She runs away in 1796, and literally, for the entirety of the rest of George Washington's life, he pursues her. He dies kind of unexpectedly in December of 1799, and there's correspondence as late as September of 1799 of him still trying to get her back. He uses federal agents, the Secretary of the Treasury, a customs collector here in Portsmouth, family members, nephews, are all employed to try and bring her back. And I think what's so dramatic and compelling about this book and this moment is that no matter what he does, he's unable to reclaim this woman. And Ona's resistance, as a 22, I had no idea that this book would publish when, in February, I knew it would be February of 2017. I had no idea that the political climate would be what it is now. And so I really didn't. But I can't think of a sort of more important or poignant moment for a book to land that discusses a 22-year-old enslaved black woman who resists the President of the United States. I think it's really important that we sort of remember that that's one of the sort of morals of the story, or one of the themes that I try to show throughout the text, which is there's always resistance. There's always this kind of struggle or fight for freedom, for democracy, for what is right, for humanity. And that's what we see through Ona's life. We see her story, but we also understand the stories of others around her who are free, who are enslaved, who are fugitives. How free is free when slavery exists? How safe are you? We see that with 12 Years a Slave, where he was a free man and he was kidnapped. And so we see through Ona's story, of course that was a much later story, but she lives a very long life. She outlives everybody, which in the 18th and early 19th century was significant. And thankfully, she leaves behind her interviews. She gives two, one to the Granite Freeman in 1845 and another in 1847, which appears on New Year's Day in The Liberator, the most well-known abolitionist newspaper. And she tells us time and time again in these interviews, I think what's so poignant, is she says, she's asked, does she regret giving up the material possessions of some nice clothes and what have you? She says, no, absolutely not. And if she had to do it again, she would. She says she was made a child of God by her escape. And so no matter how difficult her life was, and it was extremely difficult in Portsmouth and Greenland, you all will read that. But it tells us this story of perseverance. No matter how difficult her life was, and she spent 50 years looking over her shoulders. And like I said before, she was never free. She simply was never caught. And although she was a fugitive, and although she was hiding in the shadows, I truly believe that Ona never wanted to be forgotten. Thank you. So we have some time to do a little Q&A. And I actually have a few other slides that I want to show you because, we're in Portsmouth. And so before we jump to a Q&A, a question, I want to show this. This is one of those kind of archival moments that sort of geeky historians like myself get excited about. So this appeared in the New Hampshire Gazette in 1797, 8 or so months after she runs away. This is her marriage announcement. I mean, and so when I first saw this, I knew that she had gotten married from other archival stuff. But when I saw it, I thought, the bells were going off, and it was like, okay, there's so many things about this that is wild, right? The first thing is that she doesn't go by an alias, right? She's still calling herself Oney. So think about that her identity with the diminutive of her name still, stuck 8 months later, but clearly by the end of her life it changes. But she doesn't go by an alias, and within 8 months' time, she is able to find a husband. She eventually has children, but she's creating a life for herself. And so what's hilarious about this, for those of us who, when I started this project, digitization was just starting with newspapers, so I didn't have any help with that, right? So later on, I was able to find this one through indexes and indices and find this ad. But when you look at the entire newspaper, this sheet of the New Hampshire Gazette, there's this long kind of letter or announcement from George Washington. It was the end of his time in office. He was thanking the good people of New Hampshire for being such great citizens. And then 2 columns over a little bit. There's Ona. A reminder to historians that, when you do work and you use kind of digital sources, it's important because you get stuff like this. But I think looking at the entire page of the newspaper, that was once again another kind of sign of resistance, right? Whether she meant it or not, here she was resisting and defying the president in print in the New Hampshire Gazette.
The print type was set by Primus.
Yes, yes, exactly.
For the New Hampshire Gazette.
For the New Hampshire Gazette. So I think we can take some questions now.
If we could use the mic so people can hear, it's in the middle of the hallway.
Oh, someone said they can't see it, so let me just quickly say what the, this is a wedding announcement, and the important part says, in this town, Mr. John Staines to Miss Oney Judge. So in print, January of 1797, we have the marriage announcement in the New Hampshire Gazette. Yes.
I'm curious about what the situation was in New Hampshire with fugitive slaves. And did New Hampshire cooperate with the South? And did people come up, bounty hunter types come up? What was that like, and how'd she stay underground?
Oh, that's the most interesting question. How'd she do this? How did she remain never caught? It's the president, right? So there's an interesting thing sort of happening with New Hampshire at the end of the 18th century, where I write in the book that, first of all, when she arrives in Portsmouth, there are more black people at Mount Vernon than there are in all of Portsmouth. So she's really not able to hide but for so long. She's sort of conspicuous in a way that was what it was. But I think what's important to note is that slavery, although it wasn't outlawed until in New Hampshire until much later, it was definitely on its way out. It was on the wane. So she arrives in New Hampshire. They're in Portsmouth, a couple of hundred enslaved black people, and fewer who were enslaved. And so there's I won't call it a sort of abolitionist feeling, not in 1796 when she runs away. But there are definitely men and women in New Hampshire who are uncomfortable with this idea of human bondage. For religious reasons, for economic reasons. The Tobias Lear, your famed Tobias Lear, he writes and talks about, as well as Whipple, who's the customs collector here in the 1790s, he talks about the fugitive slave problem. And that these fugitives are running up to Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and it's causing a problem for the people of New Hampshire. That they're problematic, they're taking jobs, so they're but think about that, the issue of kind of fugitives and of cities where you can be safe. I won't call it a sanctuary city, but what I'll say is that there were clearly people in New Hampshire, in Portsmouth in particular, that were not willing to play ball with the president. And when he goes, during his pursuit, I'm trying to be careful here so I don't give it all away, but during his pursuit, the officials who are from New Hampshire, really they turn their back on the president. And they make a decision that it's something that they're uncomfortable with for a variety of reasons. And also because the reality was that George Washington was breaking the law. When he attempted to recapture her, he had signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law in 1793. And that law put into motion a set of a procedure on how to reclaim a fugitive. There were attorneys, there were magistrates that were to be involved in identification process, and Washington wanted none of that. And he writes this, I'm gonna make it up. He writes this, right? He says he wants it to be done as discreetly, with as little cost, as possible. He doesn't want attorneys. Want a magistrate. He wants to get Ona back. He wants to do it discreetly. This is the end of his term in office, so let's think about the importance of legacy, right? And how he wanted to be remembered as a president. Did you want to be known as someone running after a 22-year-old enslaved woman? maybe not, and therefore discretion was important. But the fact that he did not follow the law that he enacted, that made him, he broke the law. And I think that as we think about, I'm very sort of careful in the book. This wasn't necessarily a hatchet job on Washington. It wasn't, because I think he's actually a very good window into looking at some of the changing feelings about slavery. He lived in the North for many years as well. So Ona is changed by her experience in the North, but I argue so is Washington. So that by the end of his life, he too is questioning slavery. He too makes decisions about human bondage, and in his will, he emancipates his slaves upon the death of Martha. And I think for many reasons, Washington's kind of gotten a pass on the slavery subject because of that, because, well, he's not afraid. But the reality is, I think that's important to note. He's talking with the Marquis de Lafayette, who's saying, George, the slavery thing is bad. And George is like, yeah, I know, but, it's 1780 something, and I have a big farm, and a lot of my wealth is tied up in my human property. And he never, I think it's important to note, he's not willing at any point to live without that luxury. Whether he's in Philadelphia or New York or at any moment, nor does he want his wife, who is the larger slave owner, to do without that wealth as well. And I think we give George Washington great acknowledgement for his will, and I think we should, but we also have to ask the question, would George Washington have given away all of that property, all of that wealth, if he had had children? If he had had biological children who were expecting an inheritance, especially in the 18th century. He bypassed that expectation because he had no children. He had heirs, he had other people in his family, but not biological children. I think that's a question that we've got to sit with.
Thank you, Ms. Dunbar, for coming up. Actually, this is a mini reunion amongst all my friends. I came down from Midcoast, Maine, and I have some friends who came up from Massachusetts for this talk. So I really appreciate you coming down. So it's really interesting that you were just the last piece that you were just talking about on the reasons why he continued to chase her down. Because my exact question today was, because, as you said, she gave everything to Martha, do you think that it was a bigger disappointment that she escaped from the first president of the United States, or the ties and the relationship that she had to his beloved wife? So in your studies and as you looked, what do you think was the biggest disappointment, that the status that he was, and as the largest slave owner, and his wife as the largest slave owner, or was it because of his status as president?
I think that's a great question, and I know there are some book club folks over here who've read the book already. I make it very clear that this was a tag team effort between Martha and George Washington to get Ona back. That it wasn't just George, and that in every letter that he writes where he's trying to convince a customs collector or somebody to get her back, he always writes, and my wife is desirous of seeing her again. Or my wife can't find some, there's always Martha. And so at first when I'm reading these letters, I'm like, this is when I first started the project, is he trying to throw Martha under the bus here? What is it? But I don't believe he was. I do think that based upon his actions later on with his own slaves, right? And Martha's actions, I do believe that Martha was the commander of this ship. And ultimately, Ona Judge was her property. He was in charge of the estate in terms of the laws of the 18th century and coverture and controlling as a man, and also would be responsible financially for reimbursing the estate, the Park Custis estate, the grandchildren of Martha Washington. But it was Martha's slave, and I think that the moment I realized that she was so angry. That's a word I use, and they write in the Runaway slave advertisement. There was no reason for her to. We were all surprised that she ran off. Right? No provocation. Slavery sort of a provocation. They felt betrayed, and they wrote that was written several times.
Well, do you think it was a familial betrayal because she was there since 10 years old?
I think, yeah, and I think it was a familial, not familial, it was, she was their slave. And what kind of message does that send when you're the President of the United States that you can't control one woman? And there were other slaves that run off, and George Washington had advertised for them in the past. So this wasn't different. What was different was that he pursued her. They both pursued her. And I think the moment that you know how deep this runs is when Martha Washington is confronted with the decision of what happens now. You know, her plans are blown up. Eliza's still married to this guy nobody knows about, right? Now, her plan is blown. What is she going to do? Oney has run off. And she makes a decision. She sends Oney's sister. There are over 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon by the end of the 1790s. But she chose Ona's sister, whose name was Philadelphia, to serve Eliza Custis's. So her sister was forced to do the work that Ona refused to do. That's not a coincidence, right? That's just kind of cold-blooded. Like, honestly, that, you know, as a historian, you know, I'm looking for the documents where, and we have to remember, Martha Washington burned all of the correspondence between herself and George Washington. There are like 3 or 4 remaining letters. One fell out of a desk, I think, a couple of years ago, you know. But she burned, because, you know, she knew nosy people, historians like myself, would be rooting through her stuff, and so she burned everything. So we have very little in the way of Martha's words about this situation, more from George Washington, who kept pretty good records. But I think you know, it's the issue of feeling as though you are not in control as a slave owner. And also that Ona knew a whole lot. She'd been in that house, she'd witnessed it all. And in some ways, that's a liability, right? When you have someone whose eyes have seen plenty to be out in the general population. Sure.
Yes, I pretty much agree with the last gal who was here. I'm from Greenland, and a lot of the stories that we hear, actually, that Martha Washington, she had lost all of her children, and that she did look upon Ona as a daughter. And but I did hear that George had physically come into Greenland, but there seems to be no record of that. What I'd like to know, though, is I think that you mentioned in your book, which was wonderful.
Thank you.
The meaning of her name, Ona, that it came from, I've forgotten what it was.
Irish.
It sounded like Celtic, I think you said. And where she might be buried in Greenland?
Sure. So I do think I'm always careful when we talk about the relationship between the enslaved and the slave owner. So I don't use the phrase or term that Martha looked to her as a daughter, because I think sometimes that gives us a sort of inappropriate or inaccurate understanding of slavery. She did clearly see her as her top slave and someone who was intimately connected to her.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't give your daughters away. Right? I guess technically you do in America. But you know what I mean. And so I do think that there was a tremendous sense of betrayal that Martha Washington felt with Ona in terms of Greenland, there's no record of George. I've heard the sort of urban or rural legends of him going into Greenland, and I spent some time in Greenland at the county clerk office, and actually on the site where we believe her remains are today. I'll tell a quick story. Is a moment that reminds me just how great the people of Portsmouth are. I was up here doing research, and Valerie Cunningham said, you need to talk to Vicki Avery, who is now Vicki Poland, and she knows a lot about this. She's dedicated some time to it. So I just kind of randomly called her. And I said, I'm doing this work, this project, and I understand you know where the house was that she lived in for the remainder of her life. Eventually she leaves Portsmouth and she goes to Greenland because she's running, right? She's hiding from the Washingtons. And she was just so lovely in a way I probably never would have been if someone called me, I didn't know them, and she was like, yeah, sure, I'll take you, and let me get clearance, and I'll call you, because the where the house was is no longer standing, but it's on private property. So I'm very careful to protect that person's name, and but what I will say is, Vicki says, meet me at this church, and I'll take you the rest of the way. And I said, okay, we don't know each other. And I pull up, and I get into her car, and we drive about a half a mile away, and she parks. It's a fairly residential-ish area. And she says, all right, we're going to go. We've got to walk a bit. And I thought, all right. So she starts pulling out these boots. Now, I'm from Philly, right? I don't really do the nature thing all that well. And I try to like it, but it's not really me. And so I'm wearing like flip-flops and a skirt. I don't know what I was thinking. Cemetery. I don't know what my 18th, 19th century historian hat just flew off. And she starts putting on these boots. And I'm like, what are you wearing? It's August, right? What are you wearing boots for? And she's like, oh, the poison ivy. I said, okay. And I'm looking at my flip-flops. I had a pair of socks in my bag because, I went to the airport, didn't want to step on the floor. So I put my socks on with my flip-flops, and I have a skirt on. I kind of tie it at the bottom. And I'm like, look, it's August. If I don't do this now, it's not going to happen. It'll snow tomorrow, and then this is not going to happen. So let's do this. So her dog is with her. She makes the dog stay behind. She won't let the dog go to the woods. And so, it was one of those moments where I was like, let's just do it. And so I'm walking through, walk about a quarter of a mile, maybe a little longer. It's hot, there are mosquitoes, it's just not my thing. But I'm doing it because, we get to the place where the house once stood. And there have been folks who've come in to do some work. They brought in some sonars to determine if there are bodies buried on that site, and there are. There were 6 people who lived in that house. There are 6 bodies there. There's no headstone or plaque for Ona. There's one marker for the owner of the home, a woman named Phyllis Jack, who was enslaved at one point and became free and had that property. But when I got to this space and saw, what Ona would have been looking at in the woods, and sort of thinking about what 50 years in isolation in the woods meant and how difficult, and sort of smelling, I understand it's the 21st century, but it was so important for me to be there, and it really helped me finish up my manuscript. It was like this kind of conclusion that I came to, and so I went home, and on my way home, I thanked Vicki, and I got into my car. I called my husband, who's a physician, and I was like, you need to call CVS right now. I'm going to get poison ivy. I don't know what you're going to order. Do what you do. Write a script. Call it in. And he's like, well, do you have any, bumps or anything? No, I don't, but I know what's going to happen. And he was like, okay. And he called in, I don't know what he called. He called some steroid or something. And I never got poisoned. But it was this moment where I was at the end of writing the manuscript and sort of being where, and at some point maybe this the person who owns the property will make a decision about marking it, but I'm very respectful that it is private property, it is near someone's home, and yes.
Okay. Well, I live on Bradford Brook, and it's near my home. I'm just not sure where it is.
Yeah.
But her name, did you find any kind of a meaningful?
Oh, the meaning of her name. It's Gaelic, so it's we believe. So Oney, as I said, was the diminutive, but I think it was actually more connected to her father. Mm-hmm. So I did a lot of research trying to find out, okay, how many people were named Oney or Ona in Virginia in the 18th century? Hardly anyone, but there were two who showed up who were Irish, of Irish descent. And so later on, what was interesting was that when Ona does run off, her sister, who's left behind, she has a baby, and she names that baby Oney. And I was able to track what happens to Oney. So if you read to the end, you'll know what happens to the second.
This has been terrific, so thank you so much. I just, I'm assuming one of the movements in the Philadelphia area in terms of abolitionists was Quaker. And so how much influence did they have moving north? And can you speak a little bit to when the tide started to turn in New Hampshire, given there were a number of, indentured slaves or slaves in the area? Because I'd be really curious as to what that shift was. Because I know my understanding is that the Adams were also fairly active in terms of trying to put the kibosh on or stop some of the property owning of slaves.
Yeah, technically, I mean, we know that, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in particular, is sort of the hotbed for Quakerism and was a colony founded by Quakers, right, by William Penn. And so for that reason, we see slavery die out much faster. And the Germantown Quakers are actually the first Quakers who stand up and say, you know what, we're going to disown you if you own slaves anymore. We don't have that same presence clearly in New Hampshire, but what's very clear is that by the beginning of the 19th century, that there is this kind of shift in much more dialogue in print about the moral bankruptcy behind slavery. Now, technically, in terms of the laws, it doesn't end until the 1850s, but it's sort of the same with New Jersey and other places that we see it dying out, but the numbers are so very small that it's basically a free state, by the 18 teens, right? That the numbers are so very small.
And weren't the publishers also threatened in terms of as they were putting out these papers, so that they were always also working on,
Sure. The question was about publishers, abolitionist publishers in particular. Their lives were constantly threatened. Whether you were William Lloyd Garrison, I was in a PBS thing called The Abolitionists, which it talks about Douglass and others. William Lloyd Garrison is one of them, and their lives were constantly threatened. And I think that's an important note because Ona's interviews appear in abolitionist newspapers, right? So by the 1840s, she's an elderly woman. She's in her 70s, and the question I usually get is, well, why does she make the decision to talk in the 1870s? Why would she talk to the reporters, right? And I always sort of say, there's something that happens to you, and this is from, my conversations with my mother, who's now, I won't tell you, she's in her 70s. There's a moment that comes where you just stop caring as much, right? You stop the filter, and for her, as a fugitive, she knew that her value as an enslaved person was almost nil. She was beyond reproductive years. She physically could not do anything in the house or in the fields. And so who would really want to come out? Slave owners didn't want elderly slaves. They saw them as a burden. And she also, without me giving everything away, there were other reasons that she felt liberated to do this. And what's so interesting is the Granite Freeman, where she gives her first interview, and mind you, she gives in like has conversations with local people, right? So they're secondhand accounts of people who grew up knowing about the slave, George Washington slave, and they go to the cabin and they give her, you know, a little bit of money, and she would tell them their story, and they'd walk around the garden, and then they would leave. But what's so interesting is that her interview appears in May of 1845 in the Granite Freeman, and the next month, the Granite Freeman is talking about this new book of this new guy named Frederick Douglass, right? So we can link by looking at Ona's life. By the end of her life, she wouldn't have called herself an abolitionist, but she definitely was connected with abolitionists at this very sort of peak moment of anti-slavery activity.
I guess I have one more question in terms of these ads, and then I'll, but it has to do, I think it was on NPR that I heard this, where some folks are starting to scan in the Liberator papers and things like that, because I think for even 60 years after the Civil War had ended, people were trying to find family members all over. And so that's another thing that's kind of actively going. It was really fascinating.
There's a new I think you're talking about the project that Judy Giesberg is doing out of Villanova.
It sounded fabulous.
Where they're scanning in, I think they're really focusing on the Christian Recorder, which is the AME's newspaper.
There were a couple that
and
were playing around with.
Looking for advertisements of people after the Civil War who were looking for family. And basically advertising for families. You know, my son William, he was sold at the age of 10, and I think he went here. And so right now, one of the great things about technology is that it gives us the opportunity. You know, I'm so adamant about this. You have to have a certain amount of resources to be able to pick up from Philadelphia, to get on a plane, to come to Portsmouth, to pay for a hotel, to stay, to pay for camp for your kids so you can go do that, right, in order to be able to do the research. And there's something about digitization in particular that creates an accessibility to history that I'm all for, because you don't have to sort of pick up. Now, I still want you to go look at the document because it's so important, but I love the fact that we are doing more and more digitally that allows this history to be accessible to everyone.
Thank you so much for this work and for coming today. And I didn't know if Gwendolyn was also taking questions. I was curious in your in thinking about Ona and portraying her, what it was about her that you really wanted to get across, and what was your hook to kind of build the character.
Thank you for asking me. For all of you who do not know me, I'm Gwendolyn Quezaire-Presutti, and I am a living history artist. So I take a different route of getting the information than Erica here. So my training is in the social aspect. So I look at what the people at that time were doing that were in her classification. Those individuals who were enslaved, the type of plantations that they lived on. And so I dig for those records. And so I use a composite to sort of give Oney some flavor. I also spent a lot of time in emails with Mount Vernon curator to get the information about the Africans who lived in Virginia, what they were doing. Yes, they were storytellers. Yes, they were allowed to meet at night. As a matter of fact, Mr. Lunn, he did not like the idea of the slaves carrying the torches going down there to have the meetings. But the general allowed it. So yes, when they got together, they did tell stories. So this is why I added that in my performance as well. And how I got the information for a body servant here too. It's a composite of all the different wealthy plantation women who had body servants and what they had to do. And also I got the information from Mount Vernon as well. Did I answer your question?
And then we'll have our book signing, and please don't go, we have a special surprise.
Just a quick question about whether you've done any research on John and Ona's descendants, and do any of them still live in New Hampshire?
So, without giving away, there are descendants, not in New Hampshire, and Mount Vernon is actually in conversation with, because there's a process that you have to go through in order to prove a connection, right, to the family. And this often becomes extremely difficult for descendants of the enslaved, the majority of whom were illiterate, or may not have the kind of documentation that's easy to connect a family to the Washingtons or the Park Custis estate. But there's correspondence between Mount Vernon and descendants of Ona's sister. And so I was able to trace them. I made the decision to trace them up to the Civil War, then I stopped, because things just get hairy after the Civil War. But Philadelphia's story and what happens with her and her family and her life, that could be another verse.
We'll do this last one, but we do have
Okay, it's really quick, really quick. When did you start using the term enslaved individual versus slave?
Yeah, so I thank you for the questions about using the term enslaved versus slave. I make a note of this in the book. I mean, I think scholars, there's a shift with academics, those who do work on slavery. I prefer to use the term enslaved because I think it marks an action that was placed upon people, right, as opposed to an identity as a slave. And what I do in the text, and I write a note about this in the book, I sort of go back and forth between the terms, in part because I was writing a book for a general audience that was very different from my first book, and I wanted to use terminology that was familiar, like slave, to people, but I go back and forth and I explain why I do between enslaved and slave. So I think referencing enslaved is clear that it is an act that was placed upon millions of people. Thank you all.
Okay. So thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to our author and to our living actress here. If you are interested in seeing some of the sites connected with Ona, you have a paper that highlights the tours that we have. And we'll have a special one for Ona on September 2nd, so that's there. Oh, we have the book signing. Thank you, River Run Books. Books are in the corner, and Erica will be signing books here. And I move the mic over to Reverend Thompson.
Good afternoon. I had this image of Ona's pain, her anguish, as she's in Philadelphia. I'm an A&E minister, and I know that there were probably some African Methodists who were her buddies, and I hope there were some who were active in helping her to escape. The Christian Recorder, she made reference to my denomination's newspaper just a few seconds ago. But I imagine her in her deep anguish, trying to articulate to herself, to her own understanding, why it was important for her to go so far as to disappoint Martha Washington, perhaps her own mother who was longing for her return, her family, what there was in her that made her decide that it was worth her life to save her life. And so I offer this. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. And go home to my Lord and be free. And go home to my Lord and be free. No more field hands, no more house hands, no more freedom left from me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. And go home to my Lord and be free. And go home to my Lord and be free.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our program. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I am out.